Handed down in my family traditions, both Mojur and Mestiza, it is said that whenever a story is told, it becomes night. The telling of a certain kind of story in a certain kind of way with a certain kind of intention causes a starry sky and a white moon to creep from the eaves or from the corners of the heavens and to hover over the heads of the listeners. By the end of the tale, the chamber or the ground all around is flooded with daybreak. Perhaps a star shard is left behind, or a ragged thread of storm sky to show that a great something, a great someone has visited and taken time with us. And whatever of this that is left behind is ours to use toward the mending and making of life.
Sounds True presents Theater of the Imagination with award-winning author, poet, and beloved cantadora, keeper of the old stories, Dr. Clarissa Pinkola Estes, and now recorded in front of a live audience. Theater of the Imagination, the story of La Calavera, Godmother Death, on the cycles of death and renewal with Dr. Clarissa Pinkola Estes.
Thank you. What do you think would happen if we don't return to our original mother tongue? And what do you think that mother tongue is? You think it's English? Or if you're mestiza Latina, that it's Espanol? Or if you came from far away over the ocean, one of the Eastern European languages? What do you think the mother tongue is that unites all of us? If it's not symbolic language, the language of dreams and imagination. For a long time now, I've heard commentators say that there's something wrong with symbolic thought, that there's something wrong with the language of the heart and of the soul. Now, this is not true, as you know. However, there are those who, at this time in our culture, would try to eradicate that language and keep only a language of sequential, linear thought, a mathematical language without the mysteriousness attached to it. In terms of symbolic language, one of the things that I find the most wonderful of all is that even people who refute it cannot prevent themselves from speaking it in their dreams at night. Those who say that the language of art, dance, sculpture, painting, the language of writing, poetry, lyricism, any creative thought or idea, meaning something that exists today, that you created, that you made, that did not exist before, that all of those ways of being come out of the symbolic life. As you know, there's been a big discussion about whether the National Endowments for the Arts should continue. And almost unbelievably, some senators and some Congress people feel that maybe it would be a good idea to do away with supporting art. If all the mysteries of the universe were known, there would be no need for artists, because that's the artist's work, is to talk about mystery, or to paint about mystery, or sculpt about mystery, or make music about mystery. And so because there are so many mysteries, one being the mystery of war, the mystery of hatred, the mystery of racism, we need artists more than we need anything else. So this symbolic language is a language that is not irrational, but totally rational. It's based on the idea that we can know something about the most mysterious aspects of life if we will use symbolism to speak about them. For instance, Most of you are probably familiar with either Talmud or with the Bible. The Bible is written, much of it, the Psalms and the Proverbs as well, in symbolic language. Gospels also. Why? Because you're trying to talk about the ineffable. You're trying to talk about the great mysteries of life and death. You cannot talk about it without poetry, without metaphor, simile, allegory. This is the way that we can talk about things that are too big for our very small minds to comprehend. And so we can get a feeling of what they are through the beauty of the symbolic language that's used to describe them. You might say my life has been turned a little bit upside down over the last 2 years since Women Who Run with the Wolves has been published. It's not quite the way it was before, although I feel very much the same on the inside. Sometimes I feel perceived differently on the outside, and in fact, Erica Jong,
an audiobook by Dr. Clarissa Pinkola Estes.
Being on the bestseller list means that 1 million people have 1 million ideas. She said, none of them are right.
It's called Theatre of the Imagination by Dr. Clarissa Pinkola Estes. I've listened to quite a few of her books now, they're cool.
I would say that she's correct in that respect. I've been asked 2 questions over and over and over again in the last 2 years. So much so that it becomes very tiresome. And one of the questions is, do you live with wolves? And I say, no, but I was raised by them. The other question I'm asked a lot is, are you a wild woman? And I have different answers depending on who's asking. So I have found, as Gloria Steinem did, she wrote a book called Revolution from Within. And a year later, she added a chapter to her book called 1 Year Later. And in that chapter, she said that she was astounded and amazed that as she traveled across America, giving readings from her work, that the larger the media, the larger the newspaper that came to interview her, the less they understood what inner life was about. And the smaller the newspaper was, the smaller the media was, or the smaller the town was, the more people seemed to understand what it was she was talking about. And I have to say that I have found that also to be so. And it's very mysterious. It almost makes you breathless to think that in the larger cities, in the larger media, newspapers in particular, but also magazines as well, that there are people who have forgotten what inner life means, what symbolic thought means. If I've said it once, I've said it 1,000 times over the last 2 years, that no act of social action, that no act of social justice, and no act of love can be performed without a deep inner life. And what people seem to hear sometimes, especially in the larger cities, thank goodness we only have about 4 in the United States, what they seem to hear is that you have to do some sort of hocus pocus, and that you have to go off into your psyche somewhere and become a narcissistic, psychobabblish person. And so no matter what words come out of your mouth, by the time they go through that person's head and they come down their arm and they're written on the paper and edited and then put in the newspaper, you find yourself saying things that you never said before in your entire life. Tonight, I brought with me a verbatim transcript of a newspaper interview that I did with a reporter who will remain unnamed, whose city will remain unnamed. And then I also brought 3 poems that were written in the late 1960s about trying to tell people who could not read or write, who had no television or radio, that men had walked on the moon. And you'll see how these are all tied together. This poem, called A Newspaper Interview, the direct transcript, is about what happens when people no longer understand symbolic language. A newspaper interview. Well, do you still go out and connect with nature? Oh, yes, I still go out. Well, where do you go out? I mean, how do you do it? Well, I go to the desert. The desert? Yes, the desert. At night, I camp in the desert. Does the desert connect you to nature? Yes, the desert connects me to nature. Well, where do you go in the desert? I set my tent high up on a mesa, so from far away at night, it looks like a yellow lantern. Well, what do you do to connect to nature once you set up your tent? Well, I dig holes in the sand around my tent. You dig holes in the sand around your tent? Yes. I dig holes in the ground and I put mason jars in the holes. You put mason jars in the holes? Yes. Why do you put mason jars in the hole? To catch the scorpions. Scorpions? Yes. There are scorpions that emigrate in bands across the desert at night. And the mason jars keep them away? Well, no, the scorpions fall into the jars and they cannot climb out. Are there spaces between those jars? Yes. So the scorpions can get into your tent by running between the spaces? Yes. But they do not. They are attracted by the glint of the glass rims in the moonlight. And they fall in? Yes, they fall in. What if there's no moon that night? I do not camp on moonless nights. What do you do with the scorpions then? Well, in the morning, I let them loose. You don't take them home or sell them? No, I don't know any scorpion brokers. You just let them loose? Yes. This is how you connect with nature? Yes. It doesn't seem like very much to me. Well, to me, it's very much.
Hello, ducks, how are you?
Well, I don't see how you do that. How do you see that? Well, the scorpions have great respect for me. What do you mean? I am a heroine for letting their young and their old live until the end of their days. Are you pulling my leg? Yeah, maybe yes, I'm pulling your leg a little bit. Come on now, you're toying with me. Yeah, maybe yes, I'm toying with you a little bit. Well, you had me going there for a while. Yes, I had you going there for a while. Oh, why did you do that? You want the truth? Yes, tell me the truth. All right. The scorpions told me you could take a joke. It's my favorite interview. Except for the sports editor who was sent to interview me. Because the feature editor became ill. And the first thing he said was, you know anything about pop flies?
What are you getting? What food are you eating on?
Now, by contrast, I want to talk to you about a very different kind of people who live in the interior of Mexico and who are very hardworking people. They're farmers. They live down around Uvalama, which is south of the Sonora Desert. And it was the late 1960s, and the men had walked on the moon, and I saw it on television, and even though many people said that was done in a studio in ABC in New York City, I think most of us felt it was quite a feat. So here's the first time. Los Indios hear of the astronauts for the first time. The people here do not know that humans have walked on the moon. They do not know that the moon has been walked upon. They think I'm telling a good story, and they gather all around. I say, food floats up there, and they cry, oh, that's very, very good. That's good. That's good. I say, no, really.
Thanks, anyway.
Food floats up there, and people float upside down,
Good.
and you can lift
I'm a lot better than I used to be.
weights with one finger,
I feel a lot better.
People have to chase their drinking cups. And they say, oh, that's very good. Oh, that's so good. That's such a good story. And I say, honest, this is really, really true. But they're already sorting their tump lines and their packages, and they're hoisting things upon their backs, and their packages and their pots don't float on one finger. And they bend under their burdens and their bundles, and their vertebrae pop, and their ropes creak, and they say goodbye, good morning. And they go off to market, and they tell about the woman who sat at the hairpin of the road and told the story about the time the moon was walked upon. The second telling. The people of Uberlama hear of the space program for the first time. This is a group of people who are letter writers. I went to visit them because I, as a child, had been a letter writer in my own family for some of my family members who could not read or write and who were attempting to carry on love affairs. And so it was fine when they were in love, but when they were having a fight with each other, they wanted me to come and write, use the black crayon, I'm really angry. Use the red crayon, I want to show that I'm bleeding. So I found out that in the next village, which was also called Uvalama, which is often true in Mexico, you have the old village and the new village, that there was a group of people who could not read or write, and that was the village that sustained this other village economically. They had tied themselves together. And so I went to that village, the old one, and I told this story to a group of people who were all gathered around, and I said, the astronauts went up in a rocket, see? Well, it's like an airplane. Well, all right, it's like a gourd. Yes, good. It's like a drinking gourd. The drinking gourd went up into the sky. Yes, it was so big, it could hold many people. And it was propelled. It flew up into the sky by rockets. Rockets. By gunpowder explosion. By cooking fire. It flew up into the sky by cooking fire. Yes, and the astronauts, they're like birds. And yes, okay, the bird people, they wore white clothes and silver clothes and so many clothes that they became fat and they waddled. And they wore helmets. Well, a helmet goes over. Bee hat. That's right. They wore bee hats. So the bird people entered a drinking gourd. And they wore all the clothes they owned. And bee hats to keep them safe. When they arrived on the moon, they had become like babies. They could only walk so far because their umbilicus had grown back. And the moon was a mother who gave birth to the bird children who were still attached to her by the birth cord. And the bird people spoke into little hearts on sticks. And somehow the people of our world could hear them. Yes, that's right. Yes, that's good. Sometimes we can hear them in our dreams. The third telling of the man who walked on the moon. Afterward, my friend Aguilar said, "Come with me," and took me through a pine forest to a shed of a blacksmith. And there was an old man, and next to him was a barrel on fire.
You're all laughing at him, are they?
With 12 iron rods inside of it. "Tell him," motioned my friend.
Huh?
And both men squatted as I told of the man who walked on the moon. And the sun drifted through the slats in the walls and made white stripes
Alright, funny.
on the earth.
Christoph, why do you get weirded
Well,
in
finally,
dreams?
as I got close to the middle, the old blacksmith interrupted me. He said, "Oh, yes, I've been there. I've been on the moon. Mucho polvo, much dust there. I'm glad someone else finally found their way there. It takes such a long time to get things right." He laughed, and he lifted an
Okay,
iron
you
rod
must
from
have,
the
you must
fire
have said
barrel
some things that I never seen.
with tongs at one end and
I
hammer
did see one comment
to the
that made
other.
me cringe a bit, right enough.
Struck and struck and struck again
Really?
the orange glowing rod and threw it into a barrel that was brimming with cold mountain water, and the hiss made him disappear. Rational mind says, did he really disappear? Symbolic mind understands that something more is being said, something of a hidden nature, something that can't be seen with the logical, rational eye, something that can be imagined. The people of Obalama and Aguilar and the rest of the folks that I had spoken with all understood symbolic language. In fact, when I tried to speak in what I would call a sequential language, you know, the astronauts got in a rocket ship and they went up into the sky and they made their way to the moon and they got out and they walked on the moon, they got back in, they came back down to Earth. They turned it into a story first. Secondly, turned it into a language that they could themselves understand. And three, made the story even more fantastic than it already was. And by doing so, the story took on even more so the mystery of what that actual event meant at a symbolic level to all of us. The idea that truly the frontier of mind, spirit, soul, body, space, time, matter, that truly that barrier had truly been broken in some mysterious way. And yet Aguilar said, "Oh, I've broken that boundary many times. I broke it in my prayers, I broke it in my dreams, I broke it in my curanderismo, I broke it in my healing trance, I broke it in my poetry, I broke it the last time that I danced." So, taking a discrete idea, all the people who watched the astronauts on television as they walked on the moon, and, you know, they had a few cervezas. You remember it was summertime. It was hot outside. I was down in New Mexico. And people were sitting around in lawn chairs. We had the television set outside on a kitchen chair. And we were watching this whole thing. We were telling jokes, and the kids were all running around the tables, as kids do. You know, they run around one way, and then they run around the other. And we were having a good time, but, you know, it was a little bit like, so what? But when I told Aguilar was telling me that, oh, I know about that. Yes, there's more meaning to that than meets the eye. This is a dream that we have, this going into outer space and going to other places, stars and planets. And this means something mysterious. Something that fills us with awe and with wonder. It isn't run by taxpayer money. It isn't run by the federal government. It isn't run by NASA. It's run by something in the psyche that's like the dream maker, something that each and every single one of us has within us, and that came here with us, that's born in us, that's a part of us, and that cries out to be used. I dare say that if people do not use their abilities in symbolic language, that they begin to stagnate and become polluted
Oh,
with
it's
their
not
own
off,
backed up
right?
creativity,
No bother.
and they begin to suffer terribly.
Oh, didn't know.
So they have to go on, and they have to find a way to do these things, to speak this symbolic language. When people work at work that has no symbolism to it whatsoever, they begin to wither around the edges. They have to have something in their life somewhere that moistens them. His symbolic language is passionate and moist. It's erotic. It's tough. It's down in the dirt. It's grassroots. It's not sophisticated. In fact, Women Who Run with the Wolves and the rest of my written and spoken work is a mixture of academic language and symbolic language. And I've taken quite some heat from some academics for mixing the two together. One is considered what I would say, the vox populi, the voice of the people, the voice of all the people, the voice of our people, the voice of our grandmothers and our grandfathers, and all of us before we put on all the robes and the veneers that we have as educated people. Believe me, in no way do I put down education. It made a great difference in my life. In fact, I probably would not be sitting here before you if I'd not been able to educate myself. But you cannot leave the other language behind. This is a way of killing ourselves. It's a kind of what I would call almacide. Alma in Spanish means soul. Almacide, the killing of the soul. This cannot be. One of the things that we can see in our culture, a place where the symbolic language is broken, one of the most severe places that we can see it is in the way that we approach life and death in our culture, death in particular. In the classical Greek culture, there was this semi-divine physician, Asclepius. And Asclepius was a great healer, and he had a temple. And if you were ill, you would come to his temple and not only meet with the medical doctors of that time, but you would also sleep in the temple overnight. And you might say this is the original hospital. Except instead of simply being in a bed, which you were in the temple of Asclepius, you were not there to receive medicines per se, and you were not there to run around in a funny short little gown with your rear hand hanging out. You were there to dream a dream. Your dream may have an idea in it that will help you in your illness. And that if you will dream, perhaps you will see something that will strengthen you, or that will mend you, or that will help you, or that will give you insight, or that will give you direction, or will give you comfort. And so people came to the temple of Asclepius to sleep, but also to dream. And this was a potent idea. Well, you can see how far away we are from that, eh? And people, as my grandmother always used to say, people go to the hospital to die rather than to become well, as something in them allows someone else to take over all the ideas, functions, and overseeing of their bodies. I don't think this is the way that it was meant to be, but in our culture, for many reasons, the archetype of life and death, which are one idea, were split away from each other, so that there's only those who bring life and those who bring death. Now the problem with this is that we have to, in our daily life and in the larger cycles, monthly and yearly and decade cycles of our life, we have to allow things to die so that they can be renewed, or so that some spark of energy can be released from them, transformed, or so that they just go away and perhaps never appear in the form that we would recognize them as before. In our culture, as you can see from the great idea of trying to make people live, if we were to see life and death as a single force, a single cycle, matters would be looked at very differently. They would not be looked at from a legalistic point of view alone. They would be looked at from a point of view of the mystery of life and death, and that Some things, some of the time, need to be allowed to continue their cycle of entropy and decline and need to be allowed to die. There are people with Lou Gehrig's disease, with AIDS, with many different kinds of terminal diseases who have asked, could they please have assistance in dying in a way that they choose to die. So far, because there's a split in the culture, there's the idea that no, this can never happen. People must live even against their wills, even when their body is no longer useful, no longer able to sustain them, that they must live, they must live, they must live, they must live. There's a story, you can find it in many places in the world in fragments, but I believe that my grandmother had a whole story. It's called La Calavera. And it's about the idea that life and death are not separate from one another, and that there's a time for everything. There's a time for things to live, and there's a time for things to die. When you listen with your inner hearing, and when you look with your inner seeing, and when you also debate with your rational mind, you will be able to determine which is which time for what. Now, whether it has to do with your relational life, your sexual life, your physical life, whether it has to do with your work life, your recreational life, your family life, whether it has to do with your lover and mate, whether it has to do with your boss, whether it has to do with it's your time to begin new projects or to allow old ones to die. Ideals, ideas, all have their cycle, and the cycle goes like this. It begins someplace on this circle, not always at the same place, but if you were to follow the way that we understand life, it starts with incubation. Imagine down at the bottom a darkness in which, even though you can't see it, great life is going on. It's dividing and fissioning and growing and developing, even though it's in the dark, and it seems that everything is quiescent and nothing's happening. I dare say most of the time, when you think nothing is happening, something is happening. And so you move through that into quickening. You begin to feel flutters of energy that are now manifest in some way that you can actually feel and see. And soon there's a labor and a birth of an idea, an ideal, a voyage, a journey. And that gains energy more and more, more and more. Say you're in love. It's another beautiful journey.
Hello,
and it reaches a
Goldie.
zenith.
Yeah, hold on.
And the sun shines bright on that relationship, on that job, on that project.
It's a book by Clarissa Pinkola Estes, Theatre of the Imagination, Volume 1.
Gradually, almost imperceptibly, without us realizing,
It's an audiobook.
it begins to go into decline or entropy. It begins to lose energy. And it comes down, and at some point, it begins its act of dying. It loses more energy, loses more light, becomes weightier, becomes less able, doesn't have the flair, the dynamism it once had. And then finally, it has its leave-taking, its death. And it feels as though all things have moved into darkness again. And they have. But unlike the broken archetype of life and death that says you live, you die, bang. In the actual cycle, the incubation begins again. Some particle of what once was, or even some substantial piece of what once was, is incubated in the psyche. So that in relationships, for instance, where you have the heat of passion, of yearning and longing for one another, and 6 months or 2 years later you wonder what happened. What happened to all of that fire that you felt? Well, the relationship has hit its zenith and has gone into a decline of energy and perhaps even has come to its leave-taking point. But I promise you that it's incubating, and that you will again feel a burst of love and energy and yearning toward one another, and that it'll go through the whole cycle again. Some people cycle it through every few months. Some people cycle it through every few years, but it will occur. It occurs in everything. It your creative life. It occurs, obviously, in your garden. It occurs outdoors in the great forest. It occurs among animals. It occurs among the waxing and waning moons. It occurs everywhere, and we're not separate from it. They're complete with it. So a long time ago, there was an old man. He was not only old, but he was also very poor. He was not only poor,
well,
but he was also the father of...
I've already bought 4 of your books. This is the 5th one, but the other ones I've got are tailored more for women. But this one's like for everyone kind of thing. But she was, she helped in 9/11 and stuff like that with people having PTSD as well.
Of 12 children, and he could hardly make ends meet. He had used up almost everyone in the village as godparents for his children, and he just found out he was expecting a 13th. And so in desperation, he went out into the road and he said to himself, you know, I'm going to ask the first person that I meet on the road, who can be the godparent to my child? And no sooner did he say that, but he saw this white-robed figure striding toward him on the road. And sure enough, it was God. And because God knows everything, God said to the old man, old man, I'll be the godfather to your child. I know what you need. I'll take good care of him. And the old man thought for a while, and he said, well, initially it sounded like a good idea, God. But you know, I have to say that I think sometimes you treat people unfairly. I think a lot of the time, in fact, you give to the rich and you take from the poor. And I think, you know, I'd just really rather pass on it if you don't mind. And so the old man went on down the road, determined again to ask the very next person he saw to be godfather or godmother to his child. And El Diablo came striding down the road. The devil came striding down the road. And he said to the old man, oh, old man, I know everything. I am older than fire. And I would like to be the godfather to your child, and I will have a good influence on him. And the old man thought at first, well, you know, it's true that he knows all the ins and outs of everything. But then he said, you know, El Diablo, I have to tell you, please don't be offended. But, you know, it seems to me that you lead people into a great deal of trouble, and in the very end, you wind up with their souls. I don't think that would be a good thing for my child. El Diablo said, look, I'm going to show him a good time. And the old man said, excuse me, please, but I think that I'm going to move on. And that he did. He went on down the road. And the next person he met was Tixcatlipoca. And Tixcatlipoca is the god of memory.
Hello, Betty, how are you?
And the god of memory said, I'm going to be
Tam's busy, he's
the
plugged
godfather
into another
to your
screen.
child. And the old man thought for a minute. He said, well, that would be pretty good. I mean, it would mean that he would remember everything. He would perhaps get an education. But you know, I have to tell you that your other name, Tixcatlipoca, is Smoking Mirror. You also forget a great deal. I wouldn't want my child to forget. Maybe he would forget me. Maybe he would forget his family. No, I don't think it's a good idea, Tixcatlipoca. I think I'm going to pass.
I know.
I'm going to go on. And so he went down the road further until he ran into Chakmul. Chakmul is the rain god. And the rain god said to him, well, you know, I've been hearing about all this goings on about that you need a godparent for your child, and I'd like to do that for you. And the whole time that Chakmul was saying this, all these tears were running down his face, because he's also the god of mourning, and he's the god of melancholy. And the old man looked at him and he said, you know, Chakmul, please don't be offended, but I wouldn't want my child to live his life in melancholy.
You don't have to be in a war to have PTSD or
c-PTSD. So tender a heart and so sensitive a skin that he would feel everything that's wrong with the world all the time and never be able to see the sun. And so he went on down the road. The next person that he met was Coatlique, the lady of the serpent skirts. And Coatlique said, well, you know, I would be the godmother to this child. And he thought, oh boy, I'm in trouble now. You know, she's got a bad temper. He said, Well, you know, Quadlique, you know those skulls that you wear around your waist? You know, I think that's maybe a little bit harsh for a little child to start out with. So, if you don't mind, Quadlique, excuse me very much. And the old man showed lots of teeth. He said, I'm going to go moving down the road. Thank you. Thank you very much. And down the road he went. And he walked for quite some time, and no one came by, and he was feeling disheartened because it seemed that he wasn't going to be able to find a godparent. And all of a sudden, almost out of nowhere, onto the road stepped La Calavera. And La Calavera is Lady Death. And she was all in her black bone glory, and she had on her long dark robes. But she was beautiful in an odd kind of way. And she said, you know what, old man? I will be the godmother to your child. And not only that, I have the ability, because I am the god of life and death. I have the ability to teach your child to be a great healer. Well, the old man thought of it for a while. He said, you know, La Calavera, maybe you're right. You know, you bring life, you bring death. You treat everyone equally. You don't cater to the rich, you don't cater to the poor. You give everyone life, and you give everyone death as well. So I think it's a good idea. Yes, let's do it that way. And so La Calavera came on the christening day and held the little child. And then, many years later, when the child was almost grown, she came back again, and she said, I'm your godmother, La Calavera, and I would like to teach you something. And let us go out into the woods together. And so La Calavera and the young boy went out into the woods, and she said, now listen, here's how to be a great healer. When you go into the room of the patient, if I am standing at the head of the bed, this means that the patient must die. They belong to me. It is their time. But if I'm standing at the foot of the bed, it means that this patient can recover, and you should give them this little herb that grows right here on the forest floor, and they will recover, and all will be well. Well, they practiced this together, and soon, the healer was the greatest healer in all the land, and also the most wealthy, because people said he could always tell when people would live and when they would die. And it was most remarkable. He was right 100% of the time. And so one day, there was a call from the soldiers, and they came riding on their horses, saying, come quick, because the king is very, very ill, and he's called for you, no one else except you. And so the healer went, and as he went into the king's chamber, the king said to him, oh, physician, I am ill unto death, but I promise you, if you will heal me, I will give you half my kingdom. And the healer thought, ooh, half a kingdom. And he looked around, and, well, La Calavera was standing at the head of the bed, meaning that the king should die. The physician thought, half a kingdom. And before he knew it, he picked up the bed and he turned it around. And so that La Calavera was standing at the foot of the bed, and he gave the king the magical herb, and the king recovered. And the healer was quite proud of himself. And he stepped out into the hall, and La Calavera grabbed a hold of him by the wrist and said, listen, don't ever do that again. And the healer said, you know, I just, I don't know, I lost my head there for a minute. La Calavera said, you certainly did, and you almost did. So be careful, no more. And the physician promised. And so as they were riding away from the castle, the king's men came calling again, please, you must come back to the castle immediately. The king's daughter has fallen ill. The king wants no one but you. And so the healer went back to the castle.
Yeah,
And the king took
easy.
hold of him and said, "Oh, healer, oh,
Here's hoping
healer,
you
this
get
is
out
my
all this
beloved child,
lockdown
my
soon."
beloved daughter. Oh, healer, you must make her well. If you will make her well, I promise you that I will give you her hand in marriage." And the physician walked into the chamber of the princess. And she was beauty itself, and perhaps made even more beautiful with her fever that made her cheeks so rosy. And he looked down into her face and fell in love with her immediately. And he looked around, and La Calavera was standing at the head of the bed, meaning the princess must die. And the physician looked down into the princess's face, and he just lost his mind, and he picked up the bed and he turned it around so that La Calavera was standing at the foot of the bed, and he gave the princess the magical herb, and she recovered. And he was so happy. He thought, of all the good fortune that could possibly have come to me, think of it. I have the healing gift. I have half a kingdom. And I have a beautiful princess to whom I shall be wed. Isn't it wonderful? And he stepped out into the hall, and La Calavera grabbed hold of him. And she said, "You better come with me. I have something to show you." And she dragged him down a stone stairway. And at the bottom of the stairway was a stone door with an iron ring in it. And she pulled this ring up, and there was another stone staircase down which they descended again. And at the bottom of that staircase, another stone door in the floor with a great iron ring. And this also she opened, and they descended down another stone staircase that was dripping with water and moss. And there at the very bottom it opened up for as far as you can see into a huge cave that was filled with thousands upon thousands of lighted candles. Well, where are we? Well, La Calavera, where are we? It's a little bit cold and drafty down here, and what are all these velas, what are all these candles doing here? Well, this is the place where all life and all death begin. You mean these candles are like people's lives? Yes, they are like people's lives. Oh, I see. The big candles are newborn babies. They have many years yet to live, and the little tiny ones are old people. They don't have many years, and I can see that those candles are sputtering and almost ready to go out. La Calavera said, "No, you're wrong. You're wrong. Some of the big candles are newborn babies, but some of them are very old people. And some of the very tiny candles that are guttering and sputtering and ready to go out, some of those are old people, of course, but some are newborn babies, and some are middle-aged people." "Well," said the healer, "you'd show me my candle. I want to see mine," thinking it would be a great big candle. And she pointed to the tiniest, smallest candle that was smoking and guttering. And she said, "That's yours." "Oh, no, La Calavera, that can't be mine. That can't be my candle. Oh, please come, tell me another story. That's not really my..." "That is your candle." "Oh, La Calavera, please." The healer pleaded with her. "I'm your godchild. Come now, surely you can do something for me. I have half a kingdom. I have a beautiful princess that I'm going to go back and marry. My life is just beginning. Please, La Calavera, help me." La Calavera said, "I'd like to, but you can't light a new candle until the old one goes out." "Oh, La Calavera, please, please. You've been my godmother all these years. You love me, do you not? Do you not love me? Please light me another candle. And La Calavera reached over for a brand new candle, a great big one. And she picked it up, and she shrugged her shoulders, and she turned it as though she was going to light it from the little tiny candle, but instead at the last moment she set it right down on the little candle, and the flame went out, and the healer fell to his knees, and then to the ground, dead. Because you can't fool death, nor are you supposed to. Now, this is what I would ask you to contemplate for yourself. There are many things at any given time that are on that circle I talked to you about. It's what I call the life-death-life circle, because there is no death that is complete, in a sense of the lights go out and nothing ever happens ever again. So all the different parts of your life that I mentioned before, your soul life, your creative life, your recreational life, your love life, your sexual life, your erotic life, all the other parts of your life, they are all of them somewhere on that cycle, and not all in the same place at the same time, which can be a little bit confusing. It's like, why do I feel so filled with ideas, and yet I feel so dead in my family life? Or why do I feel so excited about work, and I don't care if I see my lover again for 5 years? These are because all these things move at different points on the cycle. So I would ask you to contemplate this. Think of the things that are supposed to be dying, that you are falsely keeping alive, so that they cannot go through their entropy and their death, and of course can never come to their incubation or their re-incubation, so that they can live again or be transformed in a new way. Think of the something inside you that knows absolutely when it is time for things to die and when it is time for things to live. And understand that this idea of being the life giver or the life bringer and being the death dealer lives inside all of us. It's something that comes with us. It's part of the equipment that humans come with. It's the innate knowing about when it is time for things to die and when it is time for things to live. Tsatsari is also another figure of the life and death life cycle, and she carries a copper bowl with her everywhere, and she uses it in many different ways. She holds it against her chest wall, and it becomes the breast that the milk of human kindness flows from. And she puts it over her belly, and it incubates new life. And then when people are dying and they've become too frail to sustain life anymore, Tsatsari comes to their bedside with her bowl, which becomes the sarcophagus, and she picks them up and puts them in her bowl, and she swirls them around and around and around and around, more and more and more and more, until they become smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller, until finally they become this tiny little black dot. And then she flies up into the sky. She lets down her long hair that becomes wings, and she flies up into the sky, and she flies over the land looking for a woman who has just made love. Now when she finds a woman who has just made love, she drops that little dot, ding, right into the uterus of that sleeping woman, where life begins anew. So all over the world there are symbols, a symbolic language, symbolic stories about the idea that whatever comes to an end is incubated in a new way and comes back to life. Perhaps not in the same way, but in a different way. Different, but it can never be renewed. In other words, it can never be fresh, it can never be exciting, it can never be enthusiastic, it can never be filled with itself if it's not allowed to die from time to time. In some of the old pre-Hellenic sculptures, you see people pruning trees, and the trees have figures that look very much like women, as though there's a woman inside the tree who is a tree, who is a woman, who is a tree. And people are pruning the branches in order to make them grow more fully in the spring. And that's another symbolic piece of phrasing about the very same thing, that bringing something down, lessening it, trimming it, makes it grow even more full. So I would ask you, what in your life is it time to let die, that you keep turning the bed around, administering your magical herb, whatever it is, and it recovers for a while, sort of as a shade of its former self. It doesn't have true robustness in it. If you think it does, you're not telling yourself the truth. And the idea in La Calavera is that La Calavera is part of our own psyche. It's a knowledge or a knowing that's inside of us, has always been inside of us, will always be inside of us. In analytical psychology, the kind of psychology that I do, which sometimes is called archetypal psychology and sometimes called depth psychology, with fairy tales, which I think is a valuable thing to do. You know, folklorists do one thing with fairy tales. They often try to look at culture and how this fairy tale evolved out of the culture and what that means about the culture that the fairy tale evolved from. And other people who are, sometimes they call themselves storytellers, they gather stories and they tell them, often to children, and they have a basket of stories that they carry around and that they distribute from place to place. And that's another use of stories. And then there's also stories, of course, for entertainment. There's a whole group of stories, in fact, among Buddhists, for instance, that are jokey stories. They're funny stories. And they're told to teach a little bit, but more so they're really taught to entertain, to make people laugh. And that's a good story, too. But the way that I learned them in my own family was more as apothecary, as a, you might say, a long string of medicines, each story being a medicine for the right time and the right place and the right person. And also how to tell the story in different dosages. You know, some stories, for some people you would shorten them, and for others you would expand them. Some you would put in every brutal, gory detail. Others, you would not put in so many gory details, depending on what is needed for that soul and that spirit to hear. Stories have the ability to penetrate past the ego, the simple ego, the censoring ego, to go way past that and to go into something of your psyche, my psyche, that stands way beyond that. I just received a letter that asked me, since I was a leader in the emerging field of therapeutic storytelling, would I please come to their conference and discuss this magnificent, wonderful thing that I'd done. And I wrote them a letter and I said, what I do is thousands of years old. It is neither new nor is it an emerging anything, field of anything, anywhere, anytime, any place. It's simply a very old skein that I've taken up through my own family lines. The idea that depth psychology or analytical psychology is 100 years old is facetious. It's false. Psychology is not the study of what went wrong in your family life. Psychology comes from the word pushka, which means breath. And the idea is that breath animates, and that the soul and breath are synonymous with one another. What breathes has soul. What no longer breathes means the soul has gone, the soul has left. And so psychology, psyche, is from the word pushka, breath. Psyche means study of the soul, that which animates, that which breathes, that which without it we are gone, we are no longer here, we're no longer in this body, in this place, in this time, in this world. So when I speak to you of psychology, understand that psychology has existed since the beginning of time. Any time any individual longed for or yearned for meaning in their life yearned for, longed for something greater than themselves, and yet something that was in themselves that was so great. Look at the story as though all the elements of the story belong to a single person's psyche. Take a story like La Calavera, and you would say, what does it mean to have 12 children and still be poor, still be trying to make ends meet, and to be expecting a 13th child? What would that mean to you personally? What if that were your psychic condition at the moment? That here you have all these things that you've brought to life, and somehow you're still struggling. And all of a sudden, you find out that you have one more thing to take care of, a big thing, and that you better go out and find some help and support and blessing for it. Well, you can look at it at that mundane level, but you can go even a step further and look at it at the symbolic level, which is, what does the number 12 mean in symbology in time out of mind? The number 12 is a cycle of completion. Is it 12 hours today and 12 hours tonight and 12 months to the year? And that 12 figures prominently in ancient mythology and Greek mythology and Egyptian mythology, that there are 12 parts that Osiris is cut into when he is destroyed by his brother Set, and that his sister Isis has to go find all 12 parts and put them together before the sun rises the next morning, the sun which is Osiris himself. Or that far away in the land over the 12 mountain ranges lives a certain dwarf and a certain giant who are magical. And in order to get there, one has to ride the 12 different winds of the night. This idea of 12 and 12 being also the witching hour and 12 also being the highest zenith in the sky of noon of the sun. All these come into play about this particular story. That something within the psyche is in its completion. It's over. And the number 13, contrary to some of the things that some people believe about the number 13 being unlucky, the number 13 in ancient symbology means that a new cycle is beginning, something so different than what occurred before that you can't count it as part of the 12. That the 13 is actually the part of, you might say, almost a new chromatic scale, which begins with the number 13 and goes through 12 more cycles to bring it to completion. So the number 13, which used to be associated with menstruation, among other things, when the goddess cultures fell to the newer religions, one of the things that always happens when there's a conquest of an old religion is that the gatekeepers of that religion are killed. And the scripture of that religion is either denigrated or destroyed, and the artwork and the sculptures and the rituals and so forth are all destroyed, and any remnants of them that are left are demonized. So in the number 13, which is this magical number, and you also find it magical in Kabbalah, in the Hebrew scripture, still holds as a remarkable idea among people that things have an ending and then a new beginning comes, not as number 1, but out of number 13. So you see that in the psyche, and so the question one would ask in analytical psychology is, where could this be happening in my psyche? And this is such a traditional cycle, it is so common to people, that probably it's happening someplace in your life right now. No matter who you are, no matter how old you are, no matter what you do for a living, no matter what your state of mind is, there's probably some kind of completion and something new that's born out of it, something you're not sure that you might be able to take care of and bless and develop and handle as you would like. And so you want to find something to foster it. So we would say also, within your psyche, there is an imago of God. Well, in this particular fairy tale, of which there is a fragmentary counterpart from Eastern Europe, what you see is some kind of ambivalence about the Christian culture that overlays the older culture that the fairy tale comes from. And so when God comes striding down, we're not talking about God, Lord of all things, or Mother of all things. We're talking about the kind of God that's promulgated by a bureaucratic society, or the kind of God that's put forward by an administration church rather than a soulful church. And so the old man says, nah, I don't want anything to do with that. As many people do nowadays. In this tale, what you would do in order to understand how it affects your life is to take each and every symbol and to say, oh, that's in me in some way. This know-it-all God is in me in some way, and really is not a good thing for fostering what I want in life. El Diablo is in me in some way. It is something that wants a fast trick, something that wants to make something happen without paying the dues, and make something that has some cunning about it, that figures out a way to slide under and do a halfway job and sort of halfway make it look good. And so you see in the psyche, in trying to engender what will become the healer of the psyche, that each of these figures, Chakmur, who is the rain god, who is the melancholy god, that he will be too sensitive to everything all the time and never be able to build up great strength that's consistent. And that, no, that's not a good thing to foster your idea or your ideal. No, it's not good to have that split off Quadlique, who's always wanting to dance on people's graves and so forth. And she serves her own purpose, but to engender the healing self, that may not be the right one within the psyche. And Tezcatlipoca, who is the god of memory, but how memory is, it's not always accurate. That's not good enough either. No, that's not it. But the one who governs life and death in the psyche, the one who knows these cycles, who knows when it's time for things to live and when it's time for things to die. This story proposes that she is the strongest one, or it, if you will, if you don't want to use the feminine gender, that this force is the strongest that you could find in your psyche to engender your ideas. And if you did, then you would always know when it was time for things to live and when it was time for things to die. And you would never be confused, and you would never be drugged behind some of your old dead ideas, I always like what Dorothy Parker said. She said about somebody she didn't like, he's dead, he just hasn't fallen over yet. You know how we've suffered being dragged behind a dead idea that hasn't fallen over yet. But if one were to come closer to the mystery of the life-death, life-nature, what I call that night between 2 days, if we were to become integrated or close to that and to apply it to all the things that we do, look through its eyes, hear with its hearing, sense with its sensitivities, we would be more able, more strong, more creating of soulfulness in our life. I'm sure you're thinking, well, yeah, but look what this healer did in this story. This story is to show what can go wrong, even by choosing the right mentor, you might say, in the psyche, the right layer or right aspect or right engendering aspect of the psyche. That, okay, say you've chosen properly. Yes, I'm going to come close to this nature, this La Calavera nature. But if you don't listen, there's a consequence. It begins to sever your relationship with that force. And eventually, although the story is talking about death, it's a symbolic story. Fairy tales are symbolic. They speak the symbolic language. So I'm talking about dying to this force, talking about not having properly worked with it, understood it, respected it, and that there's a consequence for that. And the consequence is to become psychically disabled in that process of knowledge or that process of knowing. So sometimes people say to me, oh, fairy tales are so brutal. You know, there are fairy tales like the Red Shoes where her feet get cut off in the end, or the Handless Maiden, which starts out with the father cutting off the daughter's arms, or the little match girl who freezes to death in the snow while she's lighting matches to create fantasies, to entertain herself and to keep her warm in a way that she's not able to keep warm with her clothes and with her surroundings. The reason there are brutal fairy tales isn't because somebody made up a group of mean stories. It's to show it can go wrong. It's choices and decisions that you can make at the spiritual and soulful level and the creative level and the actual living of life level that can take you down the wrong path, make you weaker, make your life smaller instead of larger, make you frail instead of fuerte, instead of strong and durable. So as you look at this fairy tale in the days to come, think about how you are doing in your relationship with La Calavera. Are you getting along pretty well? How many times have you thought of turning the bed around, lately? Do you really think you should continue to do that? What good could come from you allowing what is ready and what is time to die, to die? You think about what good can come from that. I always sincerely hope that by the time my time comes to die, that I can choose to die the way I'd like to. But without turning the bed around, that I would know when is the time and that I could go. And the only way I really know how to do that is to practice in the mundane world in all the things that have very little to do with physical dying. So that hopefully by the time we come to the ends of our lives, that we're maestros, we're masters at it. We have come to govern and have sovereignty, not only over our life, but also over our leave-taking of the world. Sometimes people have said to me, well, where do you think you go when you die? Where do you go? And, different people have different ideas. And I always felt that because I work so hard at my writing, there are times where you hold your head, it hurts. It very much is, like Zeus, he gives birth out of his forehead. He has this 3-day-long headache. And then finally he gives birth. Well, it feels like that sometimes. And so I thought, if I had the choice, I would like to be an inspiration. If once I leave this world, I would float or fly around in the etheric atmosphere, and I would look for artists, painters, sculptors, writers, dancers, and I would be their moment of inspiration. I would, of course, from the other side, I would know it all, right? I would be this know-it-all God. And I would come along and I just drop the thought right into their mind. Bing! And they go, oh, now I can see it. Now I can hear it. Now I can write it. I think it's good and healthy for people to have an imagination about what will happen when they die. And something that they explore themselves, not something given to them by other people, but something that came to them in their own dream life, a symbol that is personal to them, and then to develop that from there, to believe in your own images, to give credence and weight to the things that you see in your mind's eye and that you hear with your inner hearing of your sense, with your inner sensitivities. So Carl Jung had a dream that I really loved. My grandmother used to say there are people who dream for the whole community sometimes. And probably each one of us has had at least one dream that's way larger than we are personally. And especially if we're connected to a large group of people in humanitas, in a love of humanity, sometimes you begin to have regular dreams on a regular basis that are actually messages almost to the world. And Carl Jung had several of these actually, but this is the one that I want to end with tonight. he had a long series of sleepless nights, and he was struggling with some problems in his life, and he was also struggling with the psychology that he was writing, and whether it was right enough and good enough and accurate enough, and all the things that people who write theoretical psychology struggle with. And he finally went to sleep that particular night, and he dreamt that he was facing into a terrible wind, and that he was wearing a great coat, and the great coat was unfurling behind him, and the wind was cutting right through this woolen cloak, right down to his skin. And he dreamt that he could feel behind him some horrible, ominous something, a great dark force that was bearing down upon him. And he had to, in his dream, continue to head into this brutal wind, this cold, cold wind. And he felt that he could barely do that until he looked down on the palm of his hand, and there was a little tiny flame in the palm of his hand. And he realized that he should not pay attention to what was behind him, but that his whole life was about preserving this tiny little flame in his palm. And that his work, our work, or my work, and your work, is to not worry about what goes on back here, but to face into the wind and to preserve the flame until it's time to do otherwise, and to keep going. Thank you.
Volume 1 of Theater of the Imagination, the story of La Calavera, Godmother Death, on the cycles of death and renewal with Dr. Clarissa Pinkola Estes. Music by Dave Willey, Steve Trisman, and John Stubbs. Engineer, Steve Van Zandt. The original stories on this program, including La Calavera, Godmother Death, and Tassadi and Her Bowl, as written and performed by Dr. Estes, and the anecdotes and commentaries on this program, as well as the original poems, including The Newspaper Interview, Los Indios hear of the astronauts for the first time, The People of Uvalama hear of the space program for the first time, and The Third Telling of the Man Who Walked on the Moon, are international copyright, with all rights, including performance, print, recording, film, derivative, and adaptation rights, reserved to the author. The poems are from Dr. Estes' poetry collection, La Passionata, forthcoming from Alfred A. Knopf. The stories are from Dr. Estes' forthcoming book, When This Tree Has Stood Winter, also from Alfred A. Knopf Publishers.
Handed down in my family traditions, both Mojor and Mestiza, it is said that whenever a story is told, it becomes night. The telling of a certain kind of story in a certain kind of way with a certain kind of intention causes a starry sky and a white moon to creep from the eaves or from the corners of the heavens and to hover over the heads of the listeners. By the end of the tale, the chamber or the ground all around is flooded with daybreak. Perhaps a star shard is left behind, or a ragged thread of storm sky to show that a great something, a great someone has visited and taken time with us. And whatever of this that is left behind is ours to use toward the mending and making
Sounds True presents Theater of the Imagination with award-winning author, poet, and beloved cantadora, keeper of the old stories, Dr. Clarissa Pinkola Estes. And now, recorded in front of a live audience, Theater of the Imagination, the story of the lost Mother Moon on returning to what matters most with Dr. Clarissa Pinkola Estes.
Good evening. How are you this evening? We've been talking about symbolic language, about the language of the dream life, the language of poetics, and the language that comes to us as a lyric language through poetry and fairy tales and mythos and stories. We've also been talking about the life and death cycle that is actually not ending in death, but actually a night between 2 days that moves from an incubation or darkness into a quickening and a birth, and then up in a rising energy to a zenith, and then in an entropy, a decline, a waning of energy, and then down into a quiescence, and then finally death, and an incubation, a quickening, and a rising again. One of the things that I've heard this week that I hear so often, and I thought I would make an effort to give some help and some healing. You know, sometimes when people come from varied backgrounds, varied heritages, more than one in particular, a very common one in the United States is Scots, Irish, and English, for instance. And people say to me, I have no heritage. And when I hear that, I feel a hurt in my heart. Or people say, I'm Heinz 57. Or I'm a mutt, I'm a mongrel. And I don't think anybody has a purity to them, but each and every group that is in the United States once had a tribe that they came from, a heritage that was theirs, of which there was a richness of story. And I'm interested in encouraging people to return to a portion of symbolic life through the stories of their own heritage, their own bloodlines, their own culture. I'm well aware that the melting pot is very good in some ways, causes us to all decide that we have pretty much the same values of hope and health and happiness, but sometimes it severs them away from their roots. So tonight I have 2 poems for you. Cuentitos, right? Little stories. Whenever you raise a child, leave the hairy roots on the dying leaves, under the new leaves, and the dirt clogs swaying behind, so that they have something to sashay with in life. Something to show them, remind them that they are made from dust of earth and dust of stars. Something to point them toward home. For if you make them too clean, the visitor cannot find the way in. We are, all of us, flying in the saddle of a horse called fast home, toward the place we once tore ourselves from, to the place that is still open and still there, with obvious clues to our origins. As we live in the torso, we find the heart. And on the bottom of the foot, we find the answers written by the miles we covered in the dark. If you would look into the last room of the starry night, there are powers there with names. Each and every one of you may be a descendant of a great European tribe, or a great Asian tribe, or a great African tribe, or a great Latin tribe. If you would look into the last room of the starry night, there are powers there with names. Tanenbo and Valdar and the Yaga, and they are your ancestors. They are your ancestors. And they sneeze with all the waiting for you, and they've been wondering, where are you? Why do you never come to visit? They want to give you sword making and show you hidden ore among the earth's gases. They are a dust of glitter and light. So the names, quick, the names, call them by name, for they have gone shadowy from lack of your love. The deep earth drum still lives, though more and more faint now. And down there, they have a theater waiting for you that is lit by storms, and it only takes a name to start it. And some firesides, the good princes show up, and the blind one who steals earrings during the night, and the wise one who sings souls into nod, and the long chin who concocts sweets and herbs for healing, and who lays huts of boughs for grieving and extracts her cost. The one who bleeds gold breathes in your ancestors. They are all there. Your ancestors live. Quick, the names. The names. Call them by name before they lose all water and die. I think that there are many kinds of home, and that heritage is a kind of home. Another kind of home is a relationship with the Spirit, with God. And there are many people, as you know, who are disaffected Catholics, as they're called sometimes. Some people call them recovering Catholics. There are many people who have, for one reason or another, not survived their religious studies. And yet, underneath the administration of religion and beneath the bureaucracy of a religion is home, just as surely as I'm looking at you. And so to go too far away from it sets up, of course, a yearning that is almost intolerable. And sometimes people don't know what it is they're hungry for. They think that they're hungry for a new mate, or for a trip abroad, or for a better house, or for something so-called meaningful in their life. And what they're hungering for is something that was in their religiosity a long time ago. The word religion does not mean to worship. The word religion comes from the Latin religare, and it means to bind together in the way that you make a bouquet, or in the way that you would gather notes together to make a song, or in the way that you would gather colors together in order to make a painting. And the religiosum is composed of taking aspects of yourself, aspects of nature that are awesome and beautiful to you, aspects of other human beings or humanity that are meaningful to you and astonishing, and to bind yourself together with all of them to make something greater than just your simple self. Binding yourselves together with something that is numinous, something that takes on a life with you that is bigger than your life was before or without it. And for many people, that place is home, that the point of which things are bound together creates their home. A few weeks ago, a colleague of mine made a comment that a lot of people who are involved in symbolic life seem to be nostalgic, seem to be less than rational. And I said, well, what do you mean by that? And they said, well, it just seems to me that it's sort of a somewhat foolish yearning for old things, for things that are old-fashioned, things that have no use anymore. And I thought about that word nostalgic because I've heard it all my life. Nostalgic for this old song, for instance, or nostalgic for this and that. So I looked it up. I love etymology, which is the study of the origins of words. And I found out that this word has been misused in our culture for decades, if not centuries. That this word, which comes from the Latin nostalgia, it means pain for home. Pain for home. Many fairy tales, mythos, are all about finding home and the pain for home, the pain of separation, and the desire, deep desire, to find one's way home again. The fairy tales that came to mind were Peter Pan. It's the children trying to find their way home, but also Peter Pan trying to find his way home in that he lives in a land of the lost. That's not his home. It's a home that he's created to live in, a temporary home, a temporal home. Even I would call it a provisional place, a provisional life, a life where the issue is not to stay ungrown up forever, but the issue is to face the loss of home, the great pain that accompanies that. Other stories that came to mind are the story of the Wizard of Oz and Dorothy wanting so much to find her way home, and others, Mr. Fox, which is about finding your way home, and then there's the Silver Hands, which is about finding her way home again, and then there's the Red Shoes, which is about trying to find her way home again but not being successful. What is it that would separate us from home to begin with? Certainly a certain amount has to do with necessary socialization when we're little children, so that we, as grown-ups, don't do harm to each other, who understand personal boundaries and kindness toward one another. What is the function, then, of the fairy tale for young children? I think it has a great deal to do with the fact that while one is paring down a young child, in other words, socializing them, teaching them values and manners and so forth, all of which is necessary if this child is to live in this culture. Also, you might say, preserving for them the world of the imagination through the stories that we give them, almost like a satellite world that they cannot occupy full-time, that no one can occupy full-time, but that is nevertheless held for them, cared for, maintained lovingly, so that when and if they wish to enter that world, it is there, it exists for them. And that our work then with children, in terms of our caring for them and loving them, would be to help to create or preserve that satellite world filled with fairy tale stories, mythos, ideas that have numinosity to them, ideas that have a feeling for the inner life or for the soul life. So the question then, I think, is what happens if a person is not filled with those materials and that world is not created simultaneously or preserved simultaneously with their development, with their socialization? And then I think you can begin to see the pain for home that comes to people, because the world of imagination, of numinous life, has been destroyed. Saying, it's not all right for you to believe those things. Those things aren't really true. No, it's not all right for you to imagine that you're anything other than what you are. Oh no, that's foolishness. Let's only speak rationally with one another, and so on. There was a group of parents who stopped a school from teaching young children, 4th grade, 3rd grade, guided imagery. They felt that it was against their religious ideas and that it should be stopped immediately, and it was. So that in that school system, when I was an artist in residence and I wanted to talk to the children about dreams, I was cautioned to be very careful about what I said to them, because I might cause a legal action of some sort to happen to the entire district. Now, something is wrong when imagination is something that is considered more dangerous than guns. So, this return to home is important for adults to reconstruct it, to be examples to the children who are around you, whether they're your children or not, is beside the point. To reconstruct this inner world that is filled with characters and symbology and ideas and actions and prayers and gifts and all the things that make up the inner and numinous life. There's a story that I like very much. In Spanish it's called Madre Luna. In English it's called The Lost Mother Moon. And it begins as a story about how separation from the light, from a source that illuminates, allows you to know certain things that would ordinarily be hidden in the dark. My grandmother always used to say, when she was angry with someone, she would say, "He's so stupid, he thinks that the stars don't exist because you can't see them during the day." Understand? So there's certain things that exist in the psyche, in the objective psyche, that cannot necessarily be seen with the rational mind. But if you enter into relationship with them through lyric poetry, stories, songs, music, dance, etc., then you begin to see these wide doors being carved in what looked like formerly blank walls, and you begin to see something about the path back to your own home again. There was a village, a beautiful village. The people in it were good people. There were many lovers within the village, many people who had young children, many poets who would write and tell their stories. And it was a good village. The only difficulty with the village, as pristine as it was set in somewhat of an island and surrounded entirely by the darkest bogs that you could imagine. There was quicksand and sludge and quagmires all around. And so the people of the village relied on the light of the moon to light their way through the darkness, or else they would perish in the bogs. And so the problem, to be complicated more so, was that there were treacherous creatures that lived in the bogs, things of the dark that were evil and had claws and didn't care at all for human beings. And so the people were grateful to this great Mother Moon that passed over the sky and back again month after month. And there was a time, however, of every month when the sky went dark and the moon seemed to be veiled in dark veils and not seen, and the bogs became especially treacherous then. And in fact, a foolish person wandered off from the village into the bogs on a dark night with no moon and drowned. And when the Mother Moon heard about this death, she was so heartsick because she loved humans so much that she decided that she would come down on a slow star all the way down to the edge of the marshes to see what she could do to help. And so in this way, she traveled to the earth, and she wore a very dark cloak around her, and only a little circle of light at the bottom of her cloak showed on her white feet as she walked through the very dark marshes. And it was very cold, and the marshes were filled with muck and the smell of mud. And they had roots sticking up and dark tree trunks and many dark vines that were tangled and much underbrush. And at the edge of the marsh was not as thick as it became more so as she came into the middle of the place. And there she felt chilled, and Suddenly, something was not quite right, and she couldn't consider exactly what it was, but she trembled in that coldness, and she felt that there was a presence with her, and yet unseen. And suddenly a vine reached out and wrapped itself around both of her ankles and held her fast, and two more wrapped themselves around her wrists and held her fast so that she sagged forward and fell halfway to her knees. And she cried out, but because it was night and because the villagers were asleep, no one heard her cry. And as she was contemplating her difficulty, all of a sudden, off in the distance, in the dark, she heard the cry of a human. "Help me. Please help me." And she saw, just by the dimmest light of the stars, an old man who was laboring through the marshes, trying to stay on the land strips in between the bogs. And she was so concerned that she threw back her head, and the hood of her coat fell from her beautiful, glorious, luminous hair, and it lit up the bog, and the man struggled toward her. And she realized that before her was this darkest bog, and that he would fall directly into it, that she was actually luring him without meaning to, luring him to his death. And so she shook her body and shook her body until her cloak opened up fully, and a huge ray of her light spread across the bog in front of her, and he suddenly saw that he was about to come to his death. He took another path, and he was saved. And as a stranger often does, whose life has been saved, he thought no more of it. And she sunk deeper and deeper into a despair, and deeper into the mud surrounding her, and all the dark things came out and clutched around her and danced about her and chattered about her. "Let's kill her. Yes, let's get rid of her. Yes, this is the time. Now we've got her at last. Let's push her down. Yes, let's bury her. Let's bury the mother moon." And that they did. They pushed her and they drove her down and down and down and down, and cries and biting and kicking and beating her, they drove her down into the mud farther and farther and farther, until only a pool of her golden hair showed at the top of the bog. Oh, they were so happy. It was so glorious. They said, "Oh, at last we have put out the light." And they rolled a huge stone over her, so that at last her light was out. The villagers waited for the moon to come back again, and it did not. And they spoke to one another. So what's happened? It's usually not gone for more than a couple days, and suddenly it isn't here. It's been a week. And then again another week, and they were running out of food, and people had to go out, and they had to travel at night. And so they traveled across the bogs, and the suffering was great. Children became orphans, and husbands and wives and lovers were lost to each other in the bogs, and no one could find their way home again. And the mother moon was nowhere to be found. And the villagers spoke about this. We can't continue to live this way. We can't continue, more importantly, to die this way. No one should have to live like this. And they decided that that night, they would take out into the bogs with great torches. And this they did. And they searched the bogs high and low, starting at the very edge of the marshes and coming closer and closer to the center. And they found nothing, but they could hear the chattering of the evil ones in the background. They could hear and feel the sound of the claws and clicking of the evil ones running close by. And some of them either had grabbed their coats or grabbed their arms or grabbed onto their hats and tried to drag them into the bogs, and they resisted. But because there were so many of the people, they were able to throw off the evil ones, until at last they came to a place in the bog where there was a huge stone. And around the edge of the stone was a light, a ring of light that pulsed like a heartbeat, like a heartbeat. And through that ring of light, they could see just at the edge of the rock that there was a something. Was it music? No, it wasn't music. Was it a fragrance? Well, something like, but not quite. What was it? Well, this rock was not here before, they exclaimed to each other. We've never seen this before. There's something very odd about this. And so they pulled and they hauled and they shoved and they pushed. And they tried to roll the rock off and they could not move it. And so they went back to the village for more villagers, more torches. And they came back. I said, everyone must push as hard as they can to lift this great stone, whatever it is that lies underneath. We feel that we are going to lever this out. And so the strongest and the weakest all together worked and pushed, heaved and hauled until finally, bit by bit, they pushed the stone away. And as they looked down into this muddy pit, they saw the most beautiful face they had ever seen, a beautiful, luminous face that was so filled with love of humanity that they were all of them awestruck by it. A beautiful face that had such beautiful eyes that were filled with love of all things that lived, that their hearts broke and stayed broken in a very good way. And the face began to lift up and up, shedding light, golden light, farther.
It's a relative.
Afield, farther and farther, higher and higher. The face rose,
there's the original.
shedding its golden light all the time, down on the people, down on the land, the marshes, the bogs, and all the evil things ran for their underwater holes and were seen no more. And soon it seemed the face was vague, and more vague, the higher it climbed in the sky, until at last it was a golden orb.
Don't use your bollocks, Callie. You can ask a question, but whether or no I'm going to answer it is another matter. But let me pour a coffee while you think about it.
That once again they would have the light to show the way through the bogs that surrounded the village. That they would know now that there would be a short period in every cycle when the sky at night would be dark, and during those nights they would stay home, and the poets would write, and the lovers would make love, and the children would come close to their mothers and fathers, and they would tell the stories of the night the moon disappeared and was found again. Tonight there is a beautiful face shining from this window.
c-PTSD, hold on, no, pause this in c-PTSD is complex post-traumatic stress disorder, and it happens from childhood trauma. So that's what it is.
And me and thou. The moon represents time. The word moon actually comes from the word monte, which means month. And the moon was the way that people kept track before there was Zales Jewelers and Kmart, before there were clocks, about what time it was.
I'm surprised you've never heard it before.
Often, as you know, correlates with many women's menstrual cycles as well, and fertility cycles of men as well. Doctors are just finding out now that men's sperm, development's not the right word. manufacture.
Production?
That sounds like factories, doesn't it? Little factories down there in the testicles, little smokestacks, and little conveyor belts, little people working very hard. Some people have lots of shifts. Yeah. Scientists are finding I really do try to be serious. Scientists are finding that men manufacture more sperm during the times that their women are fertile than they do during times they're not, and that it may be related to this monthly cycle, that men have a cycle also, which of course women have always known that, right? That's right. and that the blessings and the mysteries of the body are far greater than
Look it up, Callie. It's complex PTSD.
So that's a wonderful thing. So there are many moon goddesses, and in some parts of the world, the moon is considered a masculine figure. In China, there's a rabbit in the moon, not a man in the moon. And in Greek mythology, there is the woman who lives in the moon, and in some cases the woman is very old. She's a crone and she has many babies, and in fact one of the very old rituals for pregnancy is to bring a cup of milk, and preferably mother's milk from a woman's breast, and to put it in a glass and set it out in the moonlight, because like attracts like in the old ideas. Like attracts like, and there's this old woman up in the moon who is the life and the death mother, and she brings new life. She brings little tiny specks of life and drops them into women's sleeping uteruses and awakens them in that way. And so the idea is that the old woman in the moon carries literally millions and billions of babies, and that if you put the milk under the moonlight, it will draw one of those little babies down on a little moonbeam.
So what have you been up to, Callie? Have you been behaving?
The woman who wants to become pregnant will drink the milk, and then she will ingest this little tiny baby that came out of the old woman who lives in the moon, and then she will be pregnant. And if you believe that story, then you probably are Catholic like me. It's very similar to the parthenogenesis of the Virgin Mary. So, the moon, or Luna, has everything in the world to do with cycles. It has to do with that cycle we were talking about zeniths and entropy. A fullness of feeling in your heart, and in that cycle an emptying out of the fullness in your heart, which accounts for, in relationship, sometimes we have a lover who's mighty fine, or a friend who's mighty fine, or a co-worker who's mighty fine, and one day we feel filled with feeling for them, and a few days later, or 2 or 3 weeks later, we feel like, yeah, they can go away, it's all right with me. It's a natural cycle, and it's probably unnatural for us to live as close as we do to one another, so that there is no time to be away from each other. That's one of my aunts who used to argue with her husband all the time. He used to say, "Go away so I can miss you." Then come back. Send them fishing all the time. You know, fishing in the summertime on the lake or in the rivers, and then ice fishing in the winter time. That was also their form of birth control. Just to send the men send the men fishing at certain times of the year. So you can look at Luna also as a piece of the mind, as a piece of the fullness of mind and the emptying out of mind in the creative cycle. All these cycles move together. Sexual cycle, creative cycle, relationship cycle, spiritual cycle. There's always a time for an emptying out, feeling kind of dry, kind of frail. And it's not to be alarmed about. It's only to be gone through and understood for what it is, because then the filling up begins again. The stone or boulder in archetypal mythology and archetypal psychology represents a substance that is undivided. And you'll see in a minute why that factor is so important to this story. It represents something that is without consciousness, but is undivided. I'm sure you've known people who are like that. They say, she has the consciousness of a rubber plant. Well, that might be a compliment compared to the consciousness of a stone. And the stone is also considered something that incubates. Like Mithra, for instance, was born from a stone. So it has this odd quality to it of being something that, in its negative light, can be so stable that no life can come from it. It can be so certain, so sure, so predictable, so present that nothing can occur. It just is. And it stays that way for thousands of years, certainly longer than we can live. On the other hand, the rock, in its most positive light, can be seen as an archetypal symbol that's similar to the womb or the uterus, the basket, the cocoon, anything that is able to hold something. And so a grotto, for instance, it's not by accident that the Blessed Mother has many grottos throughout the world. That idea that even the living rock will bring forth the numinosity of a saint or of the Holy Mother. These ideas are very ancient, and in this particular story, the rock has to be understood as something occurring within the individual or cultural psyche that is so staid, is so filled with senex energy, old energy that doesn't want to change, that wants to preserve things at all costs, that nothing can occur. You can look at a fairy tale and all the elements of the fairy tale as being one individual psyche. You can also look at fairy tales as being about an individual culture. So you could look, for instance, at the Lost Mother Moon as being a story about our culture, about the United Statesian culture. And in that respect, you would say, there's an idea about the ideal community or society where lovers always love one another, where children are always loved by their parents, where poets have a place to create, where they don't have to beg for their space or for their sustenance, and that this is an idea or an ideal. Communities of people decide together, often I think from the collective unconscious, what they will choose to value. And these values that are proposed symbolically in the Lost Mother Moon story are fine values. The problem is that the value system is surrounded by another system. And the other system is very dark and very undifferentiated and not lit, and in fact has many pitfalls to it, as often idealism does. The idealistic self is often a young self, a spiritual self, that says, oh, yes, I can see that peace can come to this earth in my lifetime. That's a young spiritual self. We were talking about the difference between soul, spirit, and ego. And the spirit is a ever youthful, ever young force within the human psyche that believes that things can be good, that things will be well, that all things will work out in the end. And it's a terribly important part of the psyche. If it's damaged in any way, people become cynical and bitter. However, holding an ideal of the spirit alone sometimes does not jibe with the consensual reality that surrounds one. So to look at a person who's walking into a store to buy a gun to kill someone, and to say that person at least is not home wasting their time sleeping in their bed is an idealistic statement. It does not participate also in the consensual reality. One of the reasons why I like the Madre Luna story so much is because it talks about putting two realities together. It does not talk about eradicating the bugs. It talks about lighting them, shedding light on them. So as we go along in this story, you see that there is a source of light, a rhythm, a time. You might say a time for everything, almost as in the biblical phrasings and poetry, that for everything there is a season. that there truly is. And that to be able to face that reality, that there's a time for things to live and a time for things to die, a time for things to be loosed and a time for things to be brought together again, and a time to sing and dance and a time to weep, that being able to integrate those cycles, many of which, at least half of which, are not our favorite place to live as human beings, in the cycle of sorrow or grief or regret, or even for some of us, for repose, rest. So we see in this story as we go along that the moon represents a sense of time in which the cycles move and change, so that things cannot stay the same. And this is a true picture of the human psyche, of the human unconscious and the consciousness of all people. So the problem becomes not that there are cycles of darkness and light, not that there are times when people cannot venture out into the outer bogs without losing their sense of self or their sense of spirit or their sense of hope. The problem comes when an individual or a culture goes out into the dark blithely and says, oh, I can do it without light. I can do it without intelligence. I can do it without really looking at the issues. I can really change it. I can really make it happen. I can really will it to happen. And if there's anything true about the unconscious, the objective psyche, it is that the self that is at the center of the psyche of each of us, that when the self wills it so, it is easy for it to be manifest.
Were you in here earlier on, Christoph? Was that the real you?
Will it so when it's busy doing something else or wishing something else or desiring something else, it's very hard for us to accomplish things by ego desire alone. You can shake it, you can rattle it, you can hit it, you can punch it, you can dunk it, you can sweet talk it, you can do all that you want to do, and it will not come about. So this particular tale, you can look at it personally. I welcome you to do that. But if you look at it culturally, you say, what could it be in the culture that is so filled with itself, so filled with ego alone, that it decides that it can walk into the dark without harm? And I leave it up to you to answer these questions for yourself. What might you think is going on within our culture and in the microcosm of ourselves as individuals that makes us feel invulnerable in some way? Could it be class differences? We are invulnerable to the man on the street that I saw recently in New York who was kneeling on a kneeler in front of St. Patrick's Cathedral, and who had grown his hair and beard, and he was a man who was of a mental state that I could not determine, but he has a sign around his neck, and it said, will you help Jesus? So whether it's that distance from, you might say, the dirt of culture, the get down dirty of culture, or whether it's blithely believing that you really could stay in your little electronic cottage and you really could watch your funny little sewer television set that pours filth into your house every day, and you really can read a newspaper that gives you 75 negative stories for every one that is neutral. What is the fallacy that we as a culture and that we as individuals carry, thinking we can go out into the dark without light and that we're going to be all right? I'm waiting for the day that someone, well, let it be me, someone says, I've discovered a new disorder.
Christoph, were you in here earlier on?
It's called something like information gorge. Information gorge syndrome. That people are becoming shaky, irritated, anxiety-ridden, because too much information buffets their minds that is like junk food and has no nourishment for them, and they are starving to death, or they are being malnourished in their psychic lives, in their real lives. And maybe there could be another disorder that would be something like naturam absentia, absence of nature, that some children have no idea what it's like to see a forest, that some children have never in their lives
Right,
seen
that's alright, but I'm asking we're getting here earlier on.
the high grass in a field. They've never seen
And my name's
a
no
raccoon
Babs.
cleaning shells down at the river. They have never seen anything that remotely resembles anything but concrete and shattered glass.
And it's certainly no Barbara.
So we have to consider these things in a story like this. Where are we in our culture with all of this? We, as a culture, have walled off certain parts of psychic observation of our culture that are actually detrimental to us in some way. The part of the story that's the hidden part that doesn't show is the wound. We've spoken a little bit about the wound coming from not paying attention to what happens when there's darkness and idealism and no light. Wound is an Old English word. It's a Teutonic word. It comes from wunde. It's very interesting because it also is related to the word to have wonder. Now how can that be? Wound is related to wonder. Not to wonder as in I wonder what that's about, but wonder as in a wonder. The Magi, a wonder. A nova in the sky, a great wonder. And the pyramids, a great wonder. How could that be? Well,
I'm
it
going to
works
lose
like
any
this.
sleep, Chris,
A long
really.
time ago, there was the idea that the wound is the only thing that brings light. In fact, Garcia Lorca wrote about la luz violeta, the violet light that emanates from the wound. That there's something about being wounded that begins a process that ordinarily would not occur. So, to be wounded, the word originates from the idea to be separated, one thing from the other. That's what the word wound means. One thing separated from the other, or an essential separated from other essentials. One way to think about this is to think that if we are separate from nature, we are automatically wounded. If we are separated from the rest of humankind, we are automatically wounded. That our wounds may not come so much from the personal, but that the deeper and larger and continuing wounds may in fact come from the way that we live and the way that we perceive how we're surrounded and by what we're surrounded with in this culture that we live in. So in this tale, the idea is that something of the cycle of time actually has some sentience to it, tremendous sentience, in fact, and that this thing that is represented in each of our psyches is some kind of chronos, in this fairy tale represented as a female, that something about this measure of time actually notices that we are dying. Someone has gone off into the bogs when there's no moon that night and has died. And that's what calls this force that keeps track all the way down into the human, the most mundane sphere, the earth, and says, what has gone wrong here? I love you. I care very much about this whole season of time that you are living in and this way that you live in it. And something has gone terribly amiss. So let us see what it is. And there's an interesting idea because this fairy tale has an element in it that is in a lot of the great religions. It's in Christianity, where God gives his only begotten Son to be born through a human being in order to save the world, in order that immortality of the soul can continue.
Son of a gun.
And this old tale shares that motif. The idea that there is something that is watching, that is knowledgeable and probably omniscient, and that watches and is so concerned that it comes down and actually begins to participate in our lives in various ways. I personally have always felt that if you ever meet a stranger at the side of the road, if you ever meet a person who you've never seen before, who helps you in a way, and when you turn to thank them, they're gone or they're driving away or walking away, that is a manifestation of spirit. That's not to say that person was not a real person or that that person was a ghost or anything like that. They may be a very real flesh and blood person, but something in them was very much of spirit to reach out to you and to help you in whatever way. I have a colleague who recently went to a museum in Munich, the Holocaust Museum, and she's a Jew, and she was weeping, could not stop, and sobbing and heaving and bent over, chest to knees, and was just, and an old woman came out of nowhere. And I handed her some Kleenex and said, I know. I just sort of wiped her nose and wiped her tears and then just turned around and disappeared.
Oh. Callie, for goodness sake.
These manifestations of godliness that occur between human beings are truly remarkable. And they are some of the best of life that can ever happen to us. The problem is that when they cease, that something, in the sense we're speaking of the culture, something in the culture that is very dark and destructive wants to catch hold of this humane love of human beings and destroy it and say it doesn't matter, it's, it's silly, it's trivial, it's stupid, it'll never work, can't do it, it's too much money, you can't change everybody, send them all to hell.
Oh, here we go. Hello, Wigs.
And so we have a culture that in some ways resembles the time of the guillotinings in France, when they would announce by poster and by crier that there was to be a beheading, and many people's prurient interest would be aroused, and they would all gather at the village square to watch the people be brought in chains.
Thanks, Wigs.
And to mount a scaffold before the whole crowd and go through the whole ritual where the priest was there to supposedly put a blessing on their damned soul, and to watch them be stripped of their clothing in some cases, and to lay their cheek upon a bloody block and have a huge knife come down with force to cut their head off and fall into a basket. There's something similar to that goes on in our culture that is very, very dark, and it often comes, unfortunately, through the television. I was watching for the 10th time, at least, an interview with Charles Manson, who is a man who is mentally ill, and who, in my opinion, cannot possibly give his permission to be interviewed on television.
Did she get stalkers?
Because his mind is not there.
Oh dear.
And it's an exploitation of a very ill person, in the manner that the Marquis de Sade used to take socialites into the insane asylums for entertainment. These are the dark things that are in the bogs, that trip the light, that lash it around its ankles and its wrists and bring it to its knees. So here we are in this terrible place where the light is driven down into the dark, and worse, a huge stone, an unliving, unfeeling thing is often brought by people who say you can't change it. If we did it for you, we'd have to do it for everyone. Well, your idea is immature. I can't hear you when you're crying. I can't hear you when you're so angry. I can't hear you when you're acting so brazen. I can't hear you because your ideas are stupid. I can't hear you because your ideas don't conform to mine. I can't hear you because your ideas are just beyond me and over my head. I can't hear you. I can't hear you. That is a stone, an unmoving heart. And so we see in this story what occurs when, on top of driving the light down and saying, this love of humanity, this love of one another doesn't matter. Other things are more important. And then putting something unmoving onto a weight on top of it. Something that can't give birth, that isn't a cocoon, that isn't a grotto, that isn't anything that can bring hope and light and life. So there we are. But there is hope. There is hope. Because we see in this really beautiful tale that this issue, even though it is peculiar to us in the electronic era and about to be the cyborg era, the accoutrements that surround us, but it is not peculiar in terms of human beings who have lived for thousands and thousands and perhaps millions of years, that this issue of caring for the group comes up over and over again. And that stories about this come up over and over again. We see in the Madre Luna story that what has to happen is that the creatures have to be chased back, pushed back, and that can't be done by fighting the creatures. This is very interesting. So the story proposes something very unique and very different, and it is to bring tremendous light back into the situation again. And you see in the story, it's not one person. This is not a story of the lunar hero or the solar heroine who comes out and says, oh, I and I alone am going to roll the stone away from this deep grave. No, the entire village comes, the entire community comes. This idea of power in numbers is an old piece of knowledge. Groups of people got to say their piece, to say what should happen next and influence things hopefully for the better. So you see in this story that something of the collective happens, the collective psyche, different than the stone, something that's active, something that's willing to go out in the dark of night when it's cold with torches and shovels and levers and who knows what else. Willing to open up that casing, that tomb that carries this most precious treasure, this precious treasure of cycles and time that gives us an idea of where we are in our lives, how to go forward, and when it's time to fall back and when it's time to proceed. So one of the things that I think you can see in the story, this idea of this beauteous face, the beauteous face. You may not remember that there's a story called The Ruinous Face. It's related to the picture of Dorian Gray. The idea that you begin to look as how you are on the inside. You begin to look on the outside as crabbed and weazened and difficult as you might be on the inside, or that you might begin to look on the outside as kind, as hopeful, and as fruitful as you feel also on the inside. And this face that is under the earth, that is in the mud, this face of the Mother Moon, this is a remarkable image. She has been literally through hell. She has been tripped, she has been tricked, she has been pushed down, she has been kicked, she has been beaten. And the first thing that happens when this stone is lifted is something so pure, and so filled with love of humanity inside of us still lives, regardless of all that this part of our nature has endured, regardless of the fact that the light that glows through us has been resting in a grave for so long. And she begins to rise back into her position. She rises back into the sky, shedding her light over all the bogs and over all the community. And she's filled with love, not bitterness. She's filled with love. She has an inextinguishable treasure that is love. And that is in us. That's not a metaphor, some story that lives between the pages of a book or in your mind. That's not just a simple metaphor. It's the truth. It's a remarkable truth that no matter how cut down, burnt down, pushed back, tortured, beaten a human being is, or a nation is, or a community is, no matter how difficult it has been, that you can come back as a loving individual again, and that you can feast on the love that is inside of you. It's an inexhaustible source.
Oh, it's warm.
Sometimes people get on the dry side of the river and all travails become magnified. And when they become magnified, they feel overwhelming. And we feel like we have to build walls and all sorts of resistances in order to deal with our perception of what has occurred to us. But there's another side. The other side is full. The other side is magnanimous. The other side is everlasting. It's ever filling itself. It never goes dry. It's a headwaters. And that's the place where this story ends, in the reclamation of that which is unendingly bountiful. So in archetypal psychology, there are many symbols of bounty. There are headwaters, there is the moon, there are the stars, there is the sun. They tend to be objects in nature. There is the world tree, the tree of life. In the Hebrew mythology, there's a huge tree from Kabbalah. So all of these figures from nature that go through their own cycles are often used as the metaphor for this inexhaustible way that we have of being. And the wound, what happens to a wound? The wound in the culture, an old wound, has to be cleaned out. Hurts. Might hurt almost as much as the original wounding or separation. Has to be cleaned out. Has to be sutured. Has to be put medicine on and allowed time, allowed chronos, allowed cycle to heal. And what you have after that is not new skin. You have scar tissue. The scar tissue is 10 times stronger than skin. And so even though it may not be the mark of an unsullied innocence in a culture or in an individual, it is a sign of strength that some kind of terrible separation occurred and was mended, some kind of separation from the center of your home place, the center of your heart, the center of your psyche, the center of spirit, of soul, of mind. And that you manage by hook or by crook in one way or the other, by thinking, talking, finding, learning, that you manage to find your way back. That's a remarkable thing, especially in a culture such as we live in. So this wound in the culture should be seen as an opportunity. And I say that not lightly, not in a glib way, not in a, crisis and opportunity come together. I don't mean that at all. I take this wound very seriously. There are some days when I rise up, and except for the hope that fills my heart constantly and consistently, I sometimes wonder if we are living in the last days of this planet. So I say it with the same kind of feeling that I have for saying that a person is sorely wounded, and that if it isn't attended to, that an amputation at the very worst is going to happen, and at the very least, which is also not good, is that a necrosis sets in, a dying, a blackening of the flesh, so that there is no life in that whole area of the psyche or the culture. So I challenge you to see what you think and where you're going to take this medicine and apply it, not only to yourself, but to your community around you, whatever community that is. If you'd like to help, there are plenty of people within your own reach, and that you can help immensely, or that you can assist, or sometimes, the best way of helping is to stand out of people's way. So there are many ways to do this. You have to imagine them. You have to walk into that world of imagination and symbolic language and see what is there for you in this wound that exists. You have to walk right into the middle of the wound. And if you will do that and sit there in that bog, in that place that is dark, you'll see that there'll be an emanation of light, just like there was around the rock. There's something living, breathing, whole, that continues. And so I'd like to end by reading you a short, long chant. This is called Abre la Puerta, means open the door. And the idea is that, and you'll see, that a wound is a door. In myths and in fairy tales, their deities and other great spirits often show up to test human beings, to see if the human will recognize them in all their many disguises. So sometimes they show up in robes, and sometimes they show up in rags. There's an old story called Diamonds, Rubies, and Pearls, in which some people go to a well, a kind person goes to the well, and an old woman shows up in rags and asks to have water drawn for her, and she says, "Oh yes, of course, I'd be most happy to." And when she does, the woman reveals herself as a deity and says, "I will reward you every time you speak. Diamonds and rubies and pearls will fall out of your mouth." And indeed they do. And so she goes home and tells her wicked stepmother that this has happened, and her wicked stepmother gets her two lazy, rotten stepdaughters to go to the well and says, "Go to the well, there's this old woman who's waiting there, and when you find her, give her whatever she wants. So she'll give you this wonderful gift." And so they go to the well, and they lay against the well, and they pout, and they scowl, and the only person who comes is a very, very wealthy woman, and she asks them to draw water, and they say, "Oh, draw it yourself, you old bag." And she says, "Oh, really? Well, I will reward you for your kindness, and from this day forward, lizards and toads and snakes will come from your mouth." And so it is. So the wild gods show up in many different shapes and conditions and disguises, and we're supposed to stay awake so that we recognize them. Abre la puerta, open the door. Her name is Hope, and she's 12 years old, going on 20 to life. She's God at 5 feet tall. And abre la puerta, open the door and let her in. Give her food. Old Florence lives in the parking garage at the university with her bags and packs on the floor all around, and she washes her 84-year-old body in the sink at the library with a piece of flannel from her deceased husband's pajamas. Abre la puerta, she is God. Florence is God. There is a God named Florencia. Remember that old abuelita, your grandest grandmother, how she staggered toward you on legs so thin? You were just a baby then, and she smiled all over your infant self. And when you rose young and steaming from the void, that was God in her abuelita form, crying with joy just to see you. Que bebebita, she'd say to you. "Oh, look at you, you baby, you." "Look," says God. She talks. God talks. Baby talk. She opened a door in her belly for you. Your grandmother is God. God is a grandmother. And you remember that red room where you grew? That was God. And remember the warm hands that received you? That was God. And you remember your father's hands holding your face? As though it were some kind of jewel that might break in that moment. He was God. Your mate who snores, well, God snores, you see. Your mate is God, who can never find his socks, and your lover, who burns for things you cannot give. That is God also. Your mate is God. God is a housewife, in mud face and hair curlers at the door, waving goodbye in a house coat. God wears a house coat. And oh, the world that is young and has loved so deeply and been betrayed, whose skin hangs like rags and whose arms have no muscle and whose eyes have lost luster, open the door of your heartaches and step through the door of your betrayal. Pass through the hole that is left in your heart. Pass through because it's a door. Abre la puerta, open the door. Do you remember that your legs are el anillo, the ring that circles the lover? Your legs make a door. Pass through the door. Abre la puerta, pass the bolt through. Open the door, the most sacred of doors. The trail through your belly and the road up your spine. Remember, fire is a door. And song is a door. A scar is a door. Abre la puerta, open the door. The forest on fire is a door, and the ocean ruined is a door. Anything that needs us or calls us to God is a door. Abre la puerta, open the door. Anything that hurts us, anything that needs us, opens the door. Abre la puerta, open the door. All of these years of seeming indestructibility, the grandfather of your world dies, and his heart explodes, and yours breaks into 1,000 pieces. These are doors. Open the doors. Abre la puerta. Pass through these doors. The world is a tribe of one-breasted women. Walk through the door of the scars on their chest. Abre la puerta. Open the door. Over the edge of the world you go, into the abyss. You march in time and put the best medicine in the worst of the wounds. Abre la puerta. Open the door. The lake in which you almost drowned, that is a door. The slap in the face that made you kiss the floor, that is a door. The betrayal that sent you straight to hell, that is a door. Abre la puerta. Open the door. Same old story. All strong souls first go to hell before they do the healing of the world they came here for. If we are lucky, we return to help those still trapped below. Abre la puerta, open the door. Hell is a door caused by pain. Opening a flower. Rain opening.
I'm out of here. Hopefully get it finished tomorrow. If I'm not done. Just get it sprayed. Signed and sprayed. Do you know something? Yous all want your heads banging together. Yous are on nuts, man. Right, I'll catch you later. Bye.